French President Emmanuel Macron has just dropped the hammer on Russia. During an explosive televised interview, he revealed that France is readying itself to take aim at Russia's oil and banks with a new raft of sanctions. Those new sanctions appear to be in line with those already threatened by US President Donald Trump. But while the sanctions are bad enough, it actually gets much worse for Russian President Vladimir Putin, because France isn't stopping there. Macron revealed something else that doesn't just have enormous consequences for the war in Ukraine, but could change the entire geopolitical landscape entirely. And we're going to explain it all, so stay with us. On May 12, Macron fielded questions on issues both domestic and international, discussing the many challenges that now face France. And it's not surprising that defense was a constant topic. Like many in Europe, France has been a major supporter of Ukraine during its fight against Putin, and Macron's people want to know what he's going to do to quell the threat of Russian expansionism. Macron delivered two solutions to the Russia problem. First was the subject of sanctions, and here Macron dropped the bombshell that France, along with the European Commission or EC, was readying a new package of sanctions in the coming days that will hit Russia's financial services and oil on secondary sellers. The EC will be working alongside the US to implement these sanctions, with Putin only being able to escape them under one condition: that he agrees to an unconditional ceasefire with Ukraine. That doesn't seem likely to happen. Russia's president has spent the last couple of months trying to toe the line between claiming that Russia is ready for a ceasefire and stating that it can't agree to such a ceasefire unless the root cause of the Ukraine issue is solved. Given that said root cause is the very existence of Ukraine as a sovereign nation, it seems unlikely that an extended ceasefire is going to be agreed upon anytime soon. Instead, Putin seems to be using ongoing ceasefire negotiations to string Ukraine and the US along. Ceasefires only happen when they suit Putin. Such was the case earlier in May, when he announced a 3-day pause in hostilities so Russia could enjoy the 80th anniversary of its Victory Day celebrations, a pause that Russia broke almost immediately. That's not enough for Macron. A full and extended ceasefire is needed if Putin wants to avoid the sanctions the US and the EC are threatening. "Our will is to take sanctions," said Macron, suggesting that France and perhaps the EC already have a package ready to go. But what came next is what would truly terrify Putin, as Macron seemed to imply that France was at least considering extending its nuclear protection to the rest of Europe. It's perhaps the worst news Putin could ask for, since along with the UK, France is one of the only European powers that has nuclear weapons besides Russia. While France isn't going to be extending its nuclear umbrella just yet, Macron said that he was ready to open talks about the possibility as long as the rest of Europe is willing to meet France's conditions. Those conditions include guaranteeing that France wouldn't be placed in a position where it's paying for the security of others. This is in line with the complaints Trump has made about the US offering Europe, particularly America's NATO allies, security guarantees with little in return. It seems that Macron doesn't want France to end up in that position. Macron also said that any decision to use the French nuclear arsenal would have to remain France's prerogative. In other words, France might stage some nuclear weapons in its allies' countries. However, those allies don't get to choose when those weapons are used. That responsibility should lie with France alone. "I will define the framework in a very official fashion in the weeks and months to come," Macron said during his interview. Again, just as with the sanctions, that statement suggests that these aren't vague ideas floating around in the French president's mind. Work is underway to extend France's nuclear umbrella. Macron just needs to ensure that the framework under which that happens suits his country. With these statements, Macron has revealed that France is on the edge of a masterstroke that could humiliate Putin. If Macron follows through on all of his suggestions, Russia may soon be hit with a raft of new sanctions that affect it economically, along with the prospect that its nuclear threat against Europe isn't as strong as it once was. But what do Macron's statements really mean? Let's dig into the sanctions first. Macron claims that France, the EC and the US are cooperating to create a raft of secondary sanctions to hit Russia where it hurts. It was Trump who first suggested using these types of sanctions. Growing increasingly frustrated over Putin's refusal to accept an extended ceasefire in April, Trump criticized Putin for attacking Ukraine during a supposed Easter ceasefire. In a Truth Social post, Trump claimed there was no reason for Putin to be shooting missiles into civilian areas, cities and towns over the last few days. The US president was referring to an incident in the Ukrainian city of Sumy that took place on April 13. The city, which is in Ukraine's northeast and shares its name with the oblast that Putin now targets after Russia pushed the majority of Ukraine's forces out of Kursk, was struck with a devastating 1-2 punch of Iskander ballistic missiles. Both targeted Sumy's Congress Center and the Sumy State University, meaning Putin had no intention of hitting military targets. At least 34 people were killed in the blast, along with 117 being injured, in an attack that took place during Ukraine's Palm Sunday celebrations. Putin had claimed Russia would cease fire during Easter. But of course, he lied, and in doing so, he inspired the wrath of the US president. It makes me think that maybe Putin doesn't want to stop the war, Trump wrote on Truth Social. He's just tapping me along and has to be dealt with differently. That different way of dealing with Putin appears to be the secondary sanctions Macron is now threatening if Russia's leader doesn't agree to a total ceasefire. So, just what are secondary sanctions? The idea behind secondary sanctions is that they indirectly punish a country by hitting the other nations that do business with that country. For instance, oil is one of Russia's main exports. France, along with many of Ukraine's other Western allies, has already hit Russia with direct sanctions on its oil. These include implementing a price cap and actively refusing to purchase the commodity. However, Russia is still selling oil, predominantly to China. With a secondary sanction, France may force China to pay a tariff or similar tax on every barrel of oil it buys from Russia, raising the commodities price and pushing China toward buying its oil from another country. If China decides to abandon Russian oil as a result, Putin gets hit hard because he would lose a massive revenue stream upon which he relies to fund his invasion of Ukraine. Think of these secondary sanctions as a kind of enhancement. The primary sanctions, under which Russia currently labours, are already hurting its economy. With new secondary sanctions, France can put a deeper squeeze on Putin while warning off potential Russian allies from supporting the Russian president's regime. These sanctions, Macron says, will target Russia's oil and financial services sectors. But how effective would they be? Both Forbes and the Carnegie Endowment have attempted to answer that question, with each noting that there are potential issues that need to be overcome before such sanctions can be truly effective. Forbes claims that the conditions for triggering such sanctions remain unclear. Yes, Macron and Trump have both stated that they'll use the technique if Putin doesn't agree to a ceasefire. But what are the timeframes? How long does Putin have to say yes? And would secondary sanctions end if Russia agreed to stop fighting for an extended period? Nobody knows yet. In terms of potential impact, secondary sanctions on oil could hurt Putin. In 2024, Russia sold 9.28 million barrels per day, or BPD, of oil, which was several 100,000 barrels above the 8.98 million BPD quota set by OPEC+. This was great news for Russia. Putin managed to pull in $3.8 billion from these sales, most of which likely went towards supporting his war effort. The idea behind secondary sanctions on oil is to take a massive chunk out of that $3.8 billion by using the power of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency to place pressure on Russia's oil customers. If that pressure works, those customers disappear, and Russia is left with millions, perhaps even billions of barrels of crude oil that it can't sell. The potential problem, as the Carnegie Endowment notes, is that secondary sanctions have the potential to create a lose-lose situation. Such sanctions would be implemented by essentially imposing a tariff on any country that buys Russia's oil. Take China as an example again. France would force China to pay punitive duties on all of China's exports into the country in response to China buying Russia's oil. Therein lies the potential problem with secondary sanctions. China has already showcased that it's willing to respond to US tariffs with like-for-like solutions of its own. Secondary sanctions create the possibility of igniting a current trade war in which the eventual winner would be whatever side blinks first. Still, the secondary sanctions will at least create pressure. A nation like China might be able to absorb that pressure, but what about Russia's other oil customers? Would they be willing to absorb the economic hit these types of sanctions create for them? Or would they switch oil suppliers to a country that isn't being targeted by France and its compatriots? Only time will tell. On the financial services side of things, France's secondary sanctions would likely take aim at any country that does business with Russia's banks. Like Russian oil, that sector is doing surprisingly well even under the weight of the direct sanctions already levied against it. In 2024, Russia's central bank said that the country's financial institutions managed to take in a staggering $40.7 billion in profits, riding off the high of Russia's 21% interest rate and impressive loan growth. That's what France would hope to target with its secondary sanctions on Russia's financial services. The concept is the same as we see with oil. Any country or individual that does business with Russia's banks has to pay a punitive fee on any exports they deliver to France. Macron, along with the EC and the US, will hope these punishments will be enough to stop other entities from doing business with Russia's banks. Less business for those banks leads to lower profits, which manifest as less economic stability inside Russia. It's all about chipping away at Russia economically. France is hoping that secondary sanctions will sting Putin at a time when he's believed to be spending up to $1 billion per day on his Ukraine invasion. Macron still needs to deliver a framework for these sanctions, with details for exactly how France will punish those who do business with Russia. The key challenge he faces is balancing that punishment with France's own needs. Still, if he gets the balance right, Putin could be in for a world of economic pain if he doesn't agree to a ceasefire soon. Then there's the even bigger nuclear umbrella issue Macron raised during his interview. We mentioned earlier that France is one of only 2 European nations, beside Russia, that have nuclear weapons. According to the Arms Control Association, France's stockpile of 219 nuclear weapons places it 4th in terms of pure numbers, with the US, Russia and China all being ahead of it. France is also yet to sign or ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW. Under the TPNW, a nation promises not to develop, test, produce, purchase, possess or stockpile nuclear weapons. Obviously, a country that has nukes can't be a party to the TPNW by design. Still, France's refusal to sign suggests it has no intention of giving up its stockpiles and may even tend to build them up to be even stronger in the future. France is also interesting from a nuclear doctrine perspective. Where most nations typically follow a no first use policy, France's doctrine, which it developed in the 1970s, has a final warning clause. Under that clause, France can deploy its nuclear weapons before a potential opponent if it believes that opponent is on the verge of striking it with nukes. That will already be worrying to Putin if France chooses to extend its nuclear umbrella. His consistent threats of nuclear war become much more of an issue when made against a nation that reserves the right to hit him first. France is also capable of deploying its nukes from air and sea, according to the Arms Control Center. On the aerial front, the country maintains a fleet of 40 land-based aircraft and 10 that can take off from carriers, which are capable of delivering cruise missiles that can carry nuclear warheads. France is also efficient. Each of these aircraft has a thermonuclear warhead available to it. By sea, France can launch nuclear warheads from 4 of its nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, which are kept in constant rotation to maintain the country's naval nuclear threat. Only one of those subs is ever at sea at any given moment, with each deployment lasting for 70 days. Even so, each sub carries missiles capable of travelling over 5,592 miles, with each also being deployed with 5 or 6 nuclear warheads to pack into those missiles. As for land-based missiles, France used to have them in silos stationed at Plateau d'Albion. However, it decommissioned those missiles in 1996 upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. Perhaps Macron's nuclear umbrella idea may see the reactivation of these silos or the establishment of new silos in other countries. So what exactly would it look like if France follows through on its plans? We might have already received hints in late April, when France deployed several of its Dassault Rafale fighter jets in joint exercises conducted alongside its European NATO compatriots. Those jets took part in an exercise based in Sweden and would be key to delivering on Macron's nuclear umbrella suggestion. Perhaps the idea would be to station several of the jets in key locations, such as Sweden, Germany, and other countries close to Russia, so they can take off and launch nukes at a moment's notice. However, you may have already noticed a potential problem with the umbrella idea. France only has 219 nuclear weapons, Furthermore, if it takes the aerial approach to extending its nuclear umbrella, that only gives it 40 land-based aircraft and 10 carrier-based fighters to cover all of Europe. It could bolster those numbers by deploying more of its submarines, perhaps into or around the Baltic Sea. But even then, the umbrella would look a little thin. Perhaps France might consider working alongside the UK, which the BBC says has around 250 nuclear weapons to toughen up its umbrella. Whatever the approach may end up being, remember that Macron says he's still figuring out the framework. France will find its European allies more welcoming to the idea than in the past. That's according to Pierre Haroche of the Catholic University of Lille. In the past, when France has made overtures, other countries have been reluctant to respond, Haroche told the BBC. They didn't want to send out the signal that they did not have complete faith in the US and NATO. Today, the situation has changed. Europe is less certain about the US nuclear umbrella than it has been at any point in NATO's history. So, many of the countries that France has approached in the past are likely going to be much more open to accepting France's nukes now. But Trump has clarified the debate, Haroche adds. It's not that the Americans are talking of removing their nuclear deterrent. Let's be clear, that does not seem to be on the table right now. But the credibility of US nuclear dissuasion is not what it was. The Trump factor may certainly have played into Macron's announcement. France's president isn't saying he no longer trusts the US. You could even see his mentions of cooperating with the US on secondary sanctions as proof that France wants to continue working with its longtime ally. However, Macron's mentions of a European nuclear umbrella suggest that he now sees France as a potential power broker in Europe as the US approach to the continent becomes less clear. Europe needs to be stronger. France is willing to spearhead whatever growth is needed. Whether the extension of the French nuclear umbrella would be enough is another question entirely. For as impressive as France's nuclear arsenal may be, Russia dwarfs it. Putin has access to a terrifying 5,580 nuclear weapons, 1,549 of which are already strategically deployed. That's more than 19 times the number of nukes France brings to the table. While Putin has enough to devastate Europe with plenty to spare, France has enough to do the same to Russia. What we may be seeing is the emergence of a new Europe-focused Cold War scenario, with France, perhaps alongside the UK, taking the mantle as the leader of the Western European side. We can only wait and see. For now, the one certainty is that France is taking an aggressive approach to dealing with Putin's refusal to agree to a ceasefire. These threats of sanctions and the extension of France's nuclear umbrella represent warnings from Macron to Putin. France is taking Russia seriously as a threat to peace on the European continent. Its responses are designed to minimize that threat while bringing an end to the Ukraine war. Now, there's one line that Macron isn't ready to cross yet. He used his interview to reiterate the fact that France isn't in favor of using the $223 billion in frozen Russian assets currently held in Brussels to support Ukraine. That's not because he doesn't believe Ukraine deserves the money. Rather, as Macron puts it, today we do not have a legal framework for delivering that cash to Ukraine. Instead, France is part of the Group of Seven agreement to use the proceeds gained from those frozen funds to provide bilateral loans to Ukraine. Still, the refusal to take that step doesn't diminish the threat France now poses to Putin. If Russia doesn't enter a ceasefire, it faces the combined prospect of economic turmoil caused by secondary sanctioning and the strengthening of Europe's collective nuclear threat. Will that be enough to convince Putin to stop his war in Ukraine, if only for a month or so? Let us know what you think in the comments, along with sharing your thoughts about Macron's latest announcement. Is this a sign that France is gearing up for a future where it, along with Europe, has to fight against Russia? How effective will secondary sanctions and the extension of France's nuclear umbrella be? Share your opinions below, and don't forget to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date news and analysis about the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, and other conflict zones around the world. We're a completely independent news source that strives to bring you the most accurate and unbiased news possible, and we truly appreciate your support.